The first whistle didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a mistake, like someone trying to remember a tune they hadn't learned all the way through. My name is Ethan Mercer. I was 37 that fall, old enough to believe I knew the difference between fear and imagination, young enough to still trust the road when it called me away from cities and into places where cell service thins out and the trees grow closer together. I'd been camping alone most of my adult life, mostly in a Volkswagen Westphalia, a faded forest green '89. I'd rebuilt myself over 2 winters in Ohio. That van had carried me through deserts that smelled like iron and heat, along coastlines that tasted of salt, into mountains where the air felt thin and honest. I trusted it more than I trusted most people. That night in Monongahela National Forest, I trusted my instincts less than I should have. I'd pulled into the dispersed campsite just before sunset, one of those unmarked clearings you only find if you've driven far enough to stop seeing other people's trash. The forest was already changing its voice, October doing what October does in West Virginia, leaves stiff underfoot, air sharp enough to make breathing feel deliberate. I parked with the van's nose facing out, habit drilled into me by years of backcountry camping. Escape routes matter, even when you don't think you'll need one. I cooked a simple dinner, listened to the last of the daylight drain out of the woods, and told myself the quiet felt earned. No generators, no nearby campers, just the slow creak of trees cooling down and the occasional rustle of something small moving through leaf litter. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. By 10, the cold had settled into the van's metal skin. I pulled the curtains, climbed into the upper bunk, and let the forest go dark around me. Sleep came in pieces, shallow and interrupted, the way it often does when you're alone somewhere remote. At some point after midnight, I woke with the vague sense that something had changed. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of the right ones. Then I heard it, a whistle, low, uneven. 3 notes that didn't resolve into anything familiar. It drifted past the van like it was carried on breath rather than wind. I lay still, staring at the fabric ceiling inches from my face, listening for it to repeat. My first thought was embarrassingly rational. A bird. There are birds that whistle at night, birds that sound wrong when you're half asleep. I told myself that explanation like it was a charm you could rub between your fingers to keep bad thoughts away. The whistle came again, closer this time. Not louder, closer, as if whoever or whatever was making it had moved just enough for the sound to feel thicker, more intentional. I slid down from the bunk and stood barefoot on the cold van floor, heart already tapping out a faster rhythm than I liked. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't open a curtain. I just listened. 3 notes, a pause, then 2 more, higher, strained like the whistler was testing the air. It wasn't random. That's what finally settled into my chest with a weight that made breathing feel different. The timing had intention. The pauses were measured. I thought about calling out, about clearing my throat, about letting whoever was out there know I was awake. I didn't do any of it. Something about the sound made me protective of my silence, like noise would give something away I couldn't afford to lose. The smell inside the van changed as I stood there. Cold metal, old fabric, a faint trace of propane. It grounded me, reminded me where I was, inside steel and glass, not out there among the trees where the whistle slid between trunks and came back altered, bent by distance and bark. Minutes passed. Or seconds. Time doesn't behave when you're scared. It stretches and compresses without asking permission. The whistle moved again, tracing a slow arc around the van. I could tell because the sound didn't just shift direction. It shifted depth, as if the forest itself was carrying it differently, depending on where it came from. I crouched and cracked the driver's side curtain just enough to look out. The moonlight was thin, filtered through branches, turning the clearing into a map of shadows that didn't line up with anything solid. I saw trees. I saw my own breath, fogging the glass. I didn't see anyone. Another whistle, right outside the passenger side now. Close enough that I felt it more than heard it, a vibration that made the skin on my arms tighten. I backed away from the window, my mind scrambling for explanations that didn't require me to accept what my body already seemed to know. Teenagers, hunters messing around, someone hiking late and being weird. Every story I told myself felt thinner than the last. The whistle changed. It dropped lower, rougher, like air being pushed through a throat that wasn't used to making that shape. And it held a note too long, let it waver, then cut it off abruptly. The sound scraped along my nerves in a way no animal call ever had. Animals communicate. This felt like someone practicing how to sound like something else. I found myself holding my breath, listening not just for the whistle, but for footsteps, for the snap of a twig, for any evidence of weight moving through the clearing. There was nothing, just the whistle, orbiting, patient. I sat on the edge of the bench seat and pressed my palms together, grounding myself in the pressure. My mind went somewhere I didn't invite it to. A memory of my father years earlier telling me about a camping trip gone wrong when he was young. He'd said, if something doesn't sound right in the woods, it probably isn't. At the time, I'd laughed it off as superstition. Sitting there in my Volkswagen, I wasn't laughing. The whistle stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It felt charged, like the moment after a door closes softly in a house you thought was empty. I waited for the forest to reclaim itself, for insects or wind to fill the gap. Nothing did. I reached for my keys, the metal cold and reassuring in my hand. I didn't start the engine. Not yet. The idea of turning it over, of announcing myself with noise and light, felt like stepping into open water without knowing how deep it was. Then, from somewhere behind the van, the whistle started again. This time it was closer than close. It was right there, just beyond the thin aluminum wall, so near I could tell the whistler was facing the vehicle. The sound didn't move. It didn't circle. It stayed fixed, steady, like whoever was making it had found the spot they wanted. My mouth went dry. My heartbeat felt loud enough to give me away. I thought about the stories I'd read, the ones people tell half joking around campfires, stories about sounds meant to draw you out, about things that don't approach until you acknowledge them. I hated myself for thinking about them, for letting folklore seep into what I wanted to be a rational situation. But fear doesn't care what you want. I slid into the driver's seat, every movement slow and deliberate, the vinyl cold through my jeans. The whistle continued, unwavering now, a single note that pressed against the van like a question I didn't want to answer. My fingers hovered over the ignition. For a moment I hesitated, not because I didn't want to leave, but because part of me needed to know, needed to look, needed confirmation that this was just another strange night story I'd laugh about later. I didn't give in to that part of me. I turned the key. The engine coughed, then roared to life, the sudden noise shattering the quiet like glass. Headlights flared, cutting hard lines through the trees. The whistle stopped instantly, so abruptly it felt like it had been severed rather than ended. I stared out into the clearing, breath shallow, eyes straining for movement, for any sign of retreat. There was nothing, no figure, no shadow pulling back into the woods, just the forest, illuminated and empty, holding its breath the same way I was holding mine. The sense of being watched didn't fade with the light. If anything, it sharpened, focused, like whatever had been out there was still present, just silent now, just waiting to see what I'd do next. My foot pressed down on the brake. The engine idled, loud and alive beneath me. The road out was clear. All I had to do was put it in gear. I didn't know then that the whistle wasn't finished with me, that starting the engine hadn't ended the encounter, only changed its rules. And that understanding settled in my gut like cold water, heavy and unavoidable, as I sat there in my Volkswagen, headlights cutting a fragile bubble of safety into a forest that suddenly felt much, much closer. I shifted the van into drive, expecting, almost hoping, that the moment the wheels rolled, the fear would loosen its grip, that motion itself would break whatever invisible thread had tied me to that clearing. Instead, the forest seemed to lean in. Gravel crunched under the tires, too loud, too final. The headlights swept across trunks and low branches, carving the world into stark fragments. I kept my eyes locked on the narrow dirt road ahead, the one ribbon of escape threading between walls of trees that looked suddenly closer than they had when I arrived. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, knuckles pale, every sense sharpened to a painful edge. 10 feet. 20. Then the whistle came back. Not behind me this time. Not circling. Ahead. It cut through the engine noise with impossible clarity, slipping between the mechanical roar like it belonged there. A higher pitch now, sharper, almost curious. My foot hesitated on the gas without my permission. The sound wasn't loud, but it was precise, placed exactly where it needed to be to make my stomach drop. The road bent slightly left, and the headlights revealed nothing but more trees, their branches tangled like fingers. No person stood there. No shape blocked the way, and yet the whistle carried from that direction, steady, confident, as if whoever was making it knew I was coming. I told myself it was acoustics. Forests do strange things with sound. I'd known that for years. I'd explained it to people around campfires, even. Sound bouncing off trunks, hills, the way valleys funnel noise. All the right words were there, lined up and ready. None of them fit. The whistle broke into a pattern, 3 short bursts, then a pause, then one long note that dipped at the end. It felt deliberate, almost responsive, like it was reacting to the van's slow crawl forward. When I eased off the gas, it stretched the final note longer, thinning it until it frayed. My chest tightened. The air inside the van felt colder, heavier, like it had weight now. I cracked the window without thinking, needing to hear it directly, unfiltered by glass. The sound rushed in, raw and intimate, close enough that my scalp prickled. It wasn't coming from far down the road anymore. It was coming from the trees just off to the right, maybe 20 yards away, pacing me. I accelerated. The van lurched forward, suspension groaning as the road dipped. The whistle didn't fade. It kept pace, matching speed in a way that made no sense. Whatever was making that sound wasn't stationary. It was moving parallel to me, through brush and uneven ground I could barely see. I risked a glance into the side mirror. Headlights washed over trunks and undergrowth. Shadows slid and snapped back into place. For half a second, I thought I saw movement, something tall, wrong in its proportions. But the angle shifted, and it was gone, swallowed by darkness and my own doubt. My heart hammered so hard it hurt. I tasted metal, adrenaline flooding my mouth. I wanted to floor it, to tear down that road and not stop until the sun came up and people existed again. But the road wouldn't allow it. Tight turns, uneven ground, the constant threat of a fallen branch or washout that could end everything in a second of bad luck. The whistle changed again. It dropped lower, rougher, no longer smooth. It sounded strained now, almost irritated, like the thing producing it was pushing beyond what came naturally. The notes wobbled, cracked at the edges, and beneath it, so faint I wasn't sure at first, I heard something else. Breathing. Not mine. It came in uneven pulls, slightly out of sync with the whistle, as if 2 different efforts were happening at once. I slammed the window shut, the glass rattling in its frame, cutting off the sound just enough to make it feel distant without making it go away. I laughed then. A short, broken sound that startled me more than the whistle had. It came out of pure panic, my mind trying to release pressure any way it could. "Get out," I muttered to myself, voice shaking. The road straightened briefly, opening into a narrow corridor where the trees pulled back just enough to let moonlight spill through. The whistle faltered, stuttering like a skipped record, then resumed farther back, no longer keeping pace. I didn't slow down, I didn't look back. For several long minutes, there was only the engine, the road, my breath slowly regaining some kind of rhythm. My shoulders stayed hunched, ready for the sound to surge forward again, but it didn't. The forest began to sound like a forest again. Wind moving high in the canopy, leaves skittering across the road. I told myself it was over. That's when I noticed the smell. It crept in subtly, threading through the van's familiar scents. Damp, sour, almost sweet in a rotten way. It reminded me of wet wool left too long in a closed space, mixed with something organic and wrong. I checked the vents, my bag, the floorboards, heart sinking as the smell grew stronger instead of fading. The whistle returned, faint now, behind me. I nearly screamed. It wasn't close anymore. It didn't need to be. The sound drifted after the van like a reminder, distant but persistent, threading itself through the trees with unnerving patience. I realized then that it wasn't chasing me. It was following. Not hurried. Not panicked. Certain. The road finally spilled out onto a wider gravel stretch, one I recognized from the map, a connector road that would eventually lead back toward a state route. Relief washed over me so fast it made my hands shake. I pressed harder on the gas, the van responding with a strained growl. The whistle faded with distance, thinning until it was nothing more than a memory pressing at the edges of my hearing. When it was gone completely, the silence felt earned but fragile, like ice you don't trust your weight on yet. I drove for another 15 minutes before I dared pull over at a small roadside turnout. I left the engine running, headlights on, doors locked. My reflection stared back at me from the windshield, eyes wide, face pale, someone I barely recognized. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until dawn, bled into the sky, until the forest loosened its grip, and the world filled back up with signs of people, mailboxes, fences, the distant hum of traffic. Only then did my body start to calm, exhaustion crashing in hard and unforgiving. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of it. I read about birds, about coyotes, about people playing pranks in remote areas. I replayed every second, every choice, searching for the moment where I'd misread something simple and let fear run away with me. But some details refused to be explained away. The way the sound moved with intention, the way it stopped the instant the engine turned over, like it understood what that meant. The way it followed without urgency, confident I couldn't outrun the memory of it. I haven't camped alone since. Not because I'm afraid of the woods, I still love them, still feel drawn to their quiet honesty, but because that night taught me something I'd spent years ignoring. The wilderness doesn't just test your gear or your planning. It tests your willingness to listen to the part of yourself that knows when something is wrong, even if you can't prove it. Some sounds aren't meant to be answered. Some are only meant to warn you how close you are to something you don't understand. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do in the middle of the night, deep in a forest that doesn't care about your confidence, is to turn the key, trust your fear, and leave before the silence decides to follow you home. The thing about leaving the forest is that the forest doesn't always leave you. I told myself I was safe the moment the sun climbed over the hills, painting the road in dull gold and turning the night into something explainable again. Daylight has a way of doing that, softening edges, making terror feel exaggerated, like a dream you woke up from too fast. By the time I pulled into a small gas station just outside of Marlinton, the fear had shrunk into something manageable. Embarrassing, even. I stood there pumping gas, hands still trembling, the smell of fuel sharp in my nose, and tried to rehearse the story the way I'd tell it later. A strange sound. Bad acoustics. My nerves getting the better of me. I practiced the smile I'd wear when I said it, the one that let people know I was in on the joke. But the van didn't let me pretend. When I climbed back inside, the smell was still there, that damp, sour rot layered over old fabric and metal. Stronger now, concentrated as if the night had soaked into the upholstery. I opened every window, every vent, drove with cold air blasting through the cabin. It didn't help. The scent clung, stubborn and intimate, like it had chosen the space. I drove all day, west and then north, putting miles between me and Monongahela. Every so often, I caught myself checking the mirrors, half expecting to see something pacing me just beyond the edge of sight. Nothing ever was. That didn't make the habit stop. It was weeks before I noticed the sound. Not a whistle, not exactly, more like a memory of one pressed thin and distant. It surfaced late at night, when traffic noise fell away and the world quieted down enough for old fears to stretch out. I'd be half asleep in my apartment, the city safely outside my windows, and I'd think I heard it threading through the hum of the refrigerator or the hiss of steam in the pipes. 3 notes. A pause. I'd sit up, heart racing, listening hard until the sound dissolved into something ordinary. I never told anyone about that part. Fear you can explain is one thing. Fear that follows you home is something else entirely. A month later, I took the van in to have the heating system checked. Winter was coming, and I told the mechanic I'd noticed an odd smell. He poked around for a while, frowning, then shrugged. "Probably moisture trapped somewhere," he said. "These old rigs do that." When I got it back, the smell was gone. Relief hit me harder than I expected. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. I started to believe, really believe, that whatever had happened in that forest had finally been put to rest. The world had returned to its proper shape. Causes led to effects. Fear had an expiration date. Then I found the mud. It was early December, cold enough that my breath fogged as soon as I stepped outside. I'd gone down to the van to grab a box of old maps I kept tucked under the rear bench. When I opened the sliding door, I saw it immediately. Dark smears along the lower paneling ground into the ridges of the rubber floor mat. I stood there longer than I should have, staring. The mud was dry now, cracked, the color of wet earth after a hard rain. It hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of that. I was meticulous about the van, about knowing every mark and scratch. This wasn't a memory playing tricks on me. The smears were long, dragged, like something had been pulled across the threshold rather than stepped. I cleaned it in silence, every scrape of the rag against rubber echoing too loudly in my ears. I didn't examine it closely. I didn't smell it. I just wanted it gone. When I was finished, I sat on the curb and let the cold bite through my jacket, grounding me in something solid and real. I didn't drive the van for a long time after that. Months passed. Winter settled in fully, heavy and gray. The city felt loud and crowded, but safe in a way the woods hadn't. I started hiking again, always during the day, always on well-used trails. I told myself I was reclaiming something, not avoiding it. Sometimes, when the wind cut just right through bare branches, I'd hear something that made me stop short. A high note, a broken rhythm. Every time, it turned out to be nothing. A bird, a person calling to someone out of sight. Still, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. Muscles tight, breath shallow. What stayed with me most wasn't the fear itself, but the moment I'd almost ignored it. That instant in the clearing when curiosity had tempted me to look, to step outside, to satisfy the part of myself that wanted proof over survival. I understood now how thin that line was, how easily experience could turn into arrogance. In the woods, confidence can be a liability. I think about that night every time I park somewhere remote, every time the dark presses close and the world shrinks to the circle of light I carry with me. I think about how sound can be a doorway, how not everything that calls out is meant for you. I still camp. I still drive the old Volkswagen, though I choose my places more carefully now. I trust my unease in a way I never did before. If something feels off, I don't argue with it. I don't wait for permission from logic or daylight. Some lessons don't come with explanations. They come with memories you carry, like scars, reminders of how small you are and how quickly the rules can change when you're alone at 1:42 a.m. in a forest that has been listening far longer than you have. I never heard the whistle again, but I know, deep in a place I don't try to name, that if I wouldn't stay long enough to find out what came after the last note. The river made a sound that night like it was clearing its throat before saying my name. I remember that because I was awake before the first splash, staring at the ceiling of my old Volkswagen camper van, listening to the way the dark pressed down on the campground as if it had weight. My name is Ethan Caldwell, 36 years old at the time, and born and raised in western Pennsylvania. The kind of guy who learned early that silence in the woods is never empty. It's just waiting. I'd been RV camping for years, chasing that American idea of freedom on 4 wheels. believing that if you parked close enough to running water and far enough from other people, you could still touch something real in this country. New River Gorge National Park felt like the right place for that. I pulled in late that evening, June air heavy and wet, the kind that clings to your skin like it's trying to hold you there. My site sat near the riverbank, trees packed tight around the clearing, their branches tangled like arthritic fingers overhead. I could smell damp leaves, old mud, and the faint metallic tang of river water that had been moving longer than any of us. It felt ancient, patient, like it didn't care whether I stayed or disappeared. I told myself that was just atmosphere. That's what camping does. It makes you poetic, makes every shadow feel meaningful. The first few hours were uneventful. I cooked a simple meal on the portable stove, ate alone on a folding chair, listening to the river roll over rocks in the distance. The sound was steady, almost soothing, like breathing. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be there during the summer of 2020, when the world felt like it was tearing itself apart everywhere else. Out here, there were no sirens, no news alerts, just trees, water, and the hum of insects vibrating the night. By midnight, I crawled into the van, shut the door, and lay back, letting the darkness settle around me. That's when the quiet started to feel wrong. Not silent, never silent, but uneven. The insects would surge all at once, then cut out abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch. The river's rhythm faltered too. I'd noticed gaps in the sound, moments where the water seemed to hesitate before continuing, as if something had disrupted its flow upstream. I told myself it was nothing. Animals move through riverbanks all the time. Deer, raccoons, maybe a black bear, though that thought made my chest tighten more than I like to admit. I checked my phone. 3:07 a.m. I remember the time clearly because I was debating whether to get up and use the campground restroom or just wait until morning. That small, mundane choice, stay comfortable or stay alert, felt oddly important in hindsight. Then came the splash. It wasn't the light, playful disturbance of a fish breaking the surface. This was heavy. A deep, concussive sound like something with real mass had entered the water fast and without caution. The river answered it with a violent churn, water slapping against the bank hard enough that I felt it through the ground, through the tires of the van. I sat up. Another splash followed, closer this time, slower, deliberate. I held my breath without realizing it, listening as the sound of water shifted from chaotic thrashing to something more controlled. Wading. Whatever it wasn't swimming anymore. It was moving through the river, step by step. That's when I heard the dragging. A wet, scraping sound, uneven and labored, like something heavy was being pulled across stones and roots. It wasn't fast, it didn't need to be. Each movement came with a pause, as if the thing was adjusting its weight, deciding where to place itself next. My rational mind kicked in hard then. It's an animal, I told myself. A wounded deer, maybe a bear with a catch in its mouth. I clung to those explanations because the alternative, that it wasn't behaving like any animal I'd ever heard, made my skin prickle. The smell hit next. It slipped through the cracked window of the van, subtle at first, a sour, brackish odor, like stagnant water mixed with something organic that had been rotting too long. It reminded me of cleaning out a flooded basement as a kid when you couldn't tell where the water ended and decay began. The dragging sound stopped. Silence rushed in so fast it felt physical, like pressure in my ears. Even the insects were gone now. The river resumed its flow, but quieter, cautious, as if trying not to draw attention to itself. Then I heard footsteps on dirt, heavy, uneven. Not the crisp snap of hooves or the soft pad of paws. These steps sank into the ground, pulling free with a wet suction sound each time. They were coming from the direction of the riverbank, coming toward the campground, coming toward me. I slid off the bed and moved to the front of the van, heart hammering so hard I was sure it would echo off the metal walls. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't even breathe properly. I just peered through the narrow gap in the curtains, forcing my eyes to adjust to the dark. Moonlight spilled through the trees in broken fragments, illuminating patches of ground like spotlights on a stage. I could see my picnic table, my folding chair tipped over where I'd left it, the edge of the clearing. The footsteps stopped just beyond that. Something stood there, half hidden by shadow and foliage. I couldn't make out its shape clearly, only the suggestion of height, too tall to be a deer, too narrow to be a bear. It shifted its weight, and when it did, I heard that dragging sound again, closer now, accompanied by a low, strained noise that vibrated in my chest more than my ears. It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a snort. It sounded like breathing through water. My mind refused to settle on a single explanation, bouncing wildly between logic and instinct. Maybe it was a person, a drunk camper who'd fallen into the river, someone injured, disoriented. That thought pulled at my conscience, sparked a flash of guilt for hiding instead of helping. Then it took another step forward, into the moonlight. I caught a glimpse of skin, pale, slick, reflecting light the way wet stones do. Its posture was wrong, hunched but upright, shoulders sloped forward like they were carrying something heavy or misshapen. One arm hung lower than the other, swinging with an unnatural looseness, fingers, or something like fingers, brushing the ground as it moved. I backed away from the window without meaning to, my heel bumping softly against the cabinet. The sound felt deafening in the stillness. The thing froze. I don't know how I knew it was listening, but I felt it. The air changed, thickened, like the moment before a storm breaks. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head toward the van. I couldn't see its face, but I knew, with a certainty that hollowed me out, that it knew I was there. At 3:11 a.m., something wet and heavy pressed against the side of my camper van. The van shuddered when it leaned against it, not hard enough to rock me free of balance, but deliberate enough to let me know it wasn't accidental. Metal groaned softly, a low complaint that traveled through the frame and into my ribs. Whatever was outside wasn't clawing or striking. It was resting its weight there, like it was testing how solid I was, how much I could hold. I stood frozen between the driver's seat and the narrow aisle, every muscle locked. My palms were slick with sweat, and the air inside the van felt suddenly thin, stale, like it had already been breathed too many times. I could smell that river stink stronger now. Mud, rot, something coppery that reminded me faintly of blood left too long in the open. Then came the sound that broke my denial completely. A slow inhale, a wet exhale. Not loud, not aggressive, just close. So close it felt like it was breathing with me. I pressed my hand over my mouth, terrified that even the sound of my breath would be enough. My heart beat in violent, uneven bursts, each thud echoing in my skull. I waited for scratching, for knocking, for anything that made sense, but none of that came. Instead, it began to move. The weight slid along the side of the van, dragging across the metal in a slow, grating pass. Whatever part of it was touching the exterior wasn't hard like bone or claw. It was soft, damp. The sound it made was dull, almost muffled, like wet fabric being pulled over steel. I followed the movement without thinking, stepping sideways as it moved, keeping the wall between us. The van felt suddenly too small, every inch of space accounted for. My thoughts raced ahead to the doors, the windows, the thin locks I'd always trusted without question. It stopped near the back. I heard it shift again, closer to the rear doors where I'd left my boots outside earlier that night. A faint clink followed, metal against metal. My keys, hanging from a hook by the door. Something nudged them. They jingled softly. The sound shot through me like electricity. My stomach dropped, a cold, hollow sensation that made my knees weaken. That wasn't accidental. That wasn't blind movement through the dark. It was curious. A low sound came from outside then, different from the breathing. It had a shape to it, a broken rhythm that rose and fell unevenly. For one horrifying second, my brain tried to recognize it as speech, tried to force it into patterns I understood, but it never quite landed. It hovered too close to familiarity without crossing into it. I tasted bile. I don't know how long it stood there. Time stretched thin, elastic, snapping and recoiling with every tiny noise. I was aware of everything, my pulse in my throat, the faint vibration of the van cooling, the way the forest seemed to lean in around us, listening. Then abruptly it stepped back. The pressure vanished, the smell thinned. I heard the wet suction of its foot, or whatever it used, pull free from the dirt, one step, then another, retreating but not leaving, circling. Panic surged, hot and urgent. I knew then, deep in my gut, that staying still wasn't safety. It was invitation. Whatever had come out of that river wasn't confused. It wasn't lost. It was deciding. I reached slowly for the flashlight wedged between the seats, fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped it. I didn't turn it on. Light felt dangerous, like a flare shot straight into the dark. Another sound cut through the night. Footsteps. Not the same ones. These were lighter, faster, coming from farther off in the campground. Someone else was out there. Another camper, maybe headed to the restroom, unaware of what was moving between the trees. A spike of terror shot through me, sharp and protective. The idea of that thing shifting its attention made my chest ache. I wanted to shout, to warn them, but fear locked my throat tight. Noise would draw attention. And I didn't know whose attention it would draw first. The footsteps stopped. A voice called out softly, "Hello?" It was distant, male, edged with uncertainty. The sound carried through the trees, fragile and human. The forest swallowed it. I heard the riverside thing move again, faster this time. Not charging, but purposeful. Leaves rustled, branches bent and snapped under weight that didn't bother to hide anymore. The other camper called out again, louder now. "Is someone there?" I crouched instinctively, peering through the front windshield. Between the trees, I saw a flashlight beam sweep across trunks and ground, erratic, nervous. It paused near the riverbank. The beam jerked violently to the side. A sharp shout cut the air, short and startled. Then silence. No scream. No struggle. Just absence. My lungs burned. I realized I'd been holding my breath again, and when I finally exhaled, it came out in a broken, shaking rush. Something in me snapped then. The last thread of denial, the part that still wanted this to be explainable. I moved. Quietly, carefully, I slid into the driver's seat and reached for the keys already in the ignition. My hands fumbled, nerves screaming, every second stretching unbearably long. I didn't turn the engine yet. The sound would be loud, sudden, but staying meant waiting for it to come back. The smell returned first, stronger, fresher. A shadow passed across the front of the van, blocking out the moonlight entirely. I felt it there, inches away from the glass. I couldn't see its face, but I sensed its attention, focused and heavy, pressing in. A shape rose slowly, just enough for me to see a suggestion of features reflected faintly in the windshield. Something elongated, asymmetrical, its head tilted, listening, considering. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, impossibly loud in the stillness. Headlights blasted through the clearing, flooding the campsite with harsh white light. The thing recoiled instantly, jerking back with a sudden, fluid motion that made my stomach churn. For a split second, the light caught it full on. It was taller than I'd thought. Its skin clung too tightly in some places, sagged too loosely in others, like it didn't quite fit what it was stretched over. Water poured from it in steady streams, pooling at its feet. Its eyes. God, its eyes reflected the headlights, wrong, dull, and unfocused, like glass left too long underwater. I slammed the van into gear and hit the gas. The tires spun, throwing mud and leaves as I tore forward, barely missing the picnic table. Something struck the side of the van, hard enough to dent the panel, a wet, heavy impact that sent the whole vehicle lurching sideways. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Branches scraped and snapped as I barreled down the narrow campground road, heart in my throat, vision tunneling. In the rearview mirror, I saw movement, shadows pacing me between the trees, keeping up longer than felt possible. Then gradually they fell back. The road widened. Lights appeared ahead. Other campsites, other people. Noise returned to the world, cicadas roaring back to life, human voices drifting faintly through the air. The shadows stopped following. I didn't slow down until I hit the main park road. I didn't stop until sunrise found me pulled over at a gas station miles away, hands still shaking on the steering wheel, clothes stiff with dried sweat. I never reported it. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when I hear water moving in the dark, when a river hesitates just for a moment, I remember that breathing. And I know, with a certainty that still chills me, that some things don't live in the wild. They wait. The sun didn't make me feel safer, it just made everything feel exposed. I sat in that gas station parking lot long after the sky turned pale, watching commuters come and go like nothing in the world had shifted. My Volkswagen idled softly beneath me, engine ticking as it cooled, a dent along the passenger side already drying into something permanent. Proof. That's what I told myself it was. Proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. But proof doesn't help when the fear has already nested inside you. I washed my face in the restroom sink, staring at my reflection like I expected to see something foreign there. Mud in my hair, river water dripping from my sleeves, eyes reflecting light the wrong way. I looked normal. Too normal. And that almost made it worse, because it meant I was the same person who had driven into New River Gorge believing solitude was harmless. I left West Virginia that morning without stopping. I didn't camp again for weeks. When I did, it was in crowded parks, paved sites, families laughing 2 spots over. Noise became comfort. Light became armor. But the river didn't let go of me that easily. At night, I started waking at exactly the same time, 3:11 a.m., heart racing, ears straining for sounds that weren't there. Sometimes I swore I could smell it again, that damp rot clinging to the back of my throat. Other times, it was the sound of water moving wrong in my dreams, slowing, thickening like it was preparing to stand up. I tried to rationalize it the way I always had. Trauma response, sleep disruption, the brain filling in gaps when it doesn't have answers. I read articles, watched videos, convinced myself it had been an injured animal, maybe even a person who drowned upstream and got tangled in debris. The human mind can turn anything into a monster when it's scared enough, but none of those explanations accounted for the way it waited. Weeks later, curiosity, or maybe self-punishment, got the better of me. I searched local news archives for that night. I didn't expect to find anything. Disappearances in national parks are messy, often unreported, lost in jurisdictional cracks. I found a brief mention buried in a community forum. Unconfirmed incident near New River Gorge campground. Camper reported missing after late-night restroom trip. No signs of struggle. Search ongoing. No name. No follow-up. My stomach twisted. I closed the laptop and sat in silence, feeling the weight of that night press back down on me. I thought about the voice calling out into the dark, the way it had stopped so abruptly, the way the forest had swallowed the sound whole. I wondered if the river had given something back, or if it had simply taken. Camping used to be about freedom for me, about believing that the land was honest, that danger announced itself clearly with claws or teeth or warning signs nailed to trees. After New River Gorge, I understood something I hadn't before. The wild doesn't owe us clarity. Some threats don't rush. They don't roar. They watch. They learn the sounds we make when we think we're alone. They let us explain them away because explanation makes us stay longer. I still drive my Volkswagen. I still love the road. But I choose my campsites differently now. I avoid rivers at night. I trust the unease that creeps in without reason. When the insects fall silent all at once, I don't wait to find out why. Because whatever came out of that river didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a reminder that some places remember us long after we leave, that some waters carry things they never fully release, and that when the dark feels like it's listening, it probably is. I don't tell this story to scare people away from camping. I tell it because the wilderness isn't just scenery, it's presence, and presence can press back. If you ever wake up near a river and hear splashing that sounds too heavy, footsteps that don't hurry, breathing that feels close enough to share your air, don't argue with yourself. Don't wait for proof. Leave, because some things don't chase. They just come out of the water and see who stays. The first thing I remember is how the forest went quiet, not peacefully quiet, but the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. My name is Ethan Morales. I was 34 years old that summer, and I'd been on the road long enough to believe I understood the difference between danger and discomfort. I was traveling in a 1987 Volkswagen Vanagon, dull blue, patched with rust freckles and memories, the kind of van that smells faintly of oil, pine sap, and old coffee no matter how many times you clean it. I'd driven it across deserts, slept beside highways, tucked it into desert washes and coastal pullouts. It had never failed me. And I had learned, wrongly, that if you respect the land, it respects you back. That belief followed me into Blackwater Falls State Park like a quiet promise I didn't realize I was about to break. I arrived just before dusk, late August air already cooling, the kind that slips under your shirt and rests against your spine. The falls were roaring somewhere beyond the trees, a low, distant thunder that never quite faded into the background. It wasn't loud enough to be comforting, but it wasn't quiet enough to ignore either. It was always there, pressing, reminding. I chose Site 27, tucked far enough from the main loop to feel private. Too private, maybe. The gravel crunched under my tires as I parked, the van rocking slightly as the engine ticked itself cool. The smell hit me as soon as I opened the door. Wet earth, moss, something metallic underneath, like rainwater sitting too long in an old bucket. I told myself it was normal. Forests smell like decay. That's how they live. As I set up for the night, unfolding the rear bed, hanging a small LED lantern, cracking a window for air, I noticed how quickly the light was draining from the woods. The shadows didn't stretch. They thickened. The trees didn't sway much, but they creaked, slow and deliberate like joints remembering old injuries. Still, I cooked dinner. Still, I ate. Still, I told myself stories I'd learned to tell alone. By the time darkness settled completely, the campground felt thinned. Not empty, thinned. Like a place where something had been removed, but the outline remained. I could see a few other RVs down the loop, their windows glowing faintly, but no voices carried. No laughter, no radios. Even the insects seemed to pause between bursts of sound, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. That's when the camp host arrived. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Slow, measured crunches on gravel, stopping just short of my sight boundary. When I stepped out of the van, he was already there, standing too still beside the post with my sight number. He was older, maybe late 60s, wearing the standard host uniform. Khaki shirt, patch on the sleeve, cap pulled low. But his face didn't match the outfit. It was pale, unnaturally so under the lantern light, and drawn tight, like skin stretched over something brittle. His eyes flicked past me toward the trees, then back again, never quite settling. "You're staying the night?" he asked. His voice was flat, not unfriendly, just emptied out. "Yeah," I said, "just passing through one night." He nodded, once, then again, like he was counting something only he could see. "You should leave," he said. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because that's what you do when someone says something that doesn't fit the shape of the moment. "Leave?" He stepped closer. I noticed then that his hands were trembling, just slightly, like they were resisting a memory. "Before midnight," he said. "After that, this place isn't safe." The words landed wrong. Too rehearsed. Too certain. "I've camped here before," I said, though it wasn't entirely true. I'd passed through years ago, but memory has a way of smoothing things over. "I'll be fine." He looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not fear exactly, but resignation. The look of someone who has warned too many people and learned what happens when they don't listen. "Lock your doors," he said. "Don't answer if you hear knocking. And whatever you do—" A sound rose from the woods then. Not loud, not sharp, just a single, long exhale like wind through a narrow throat. The host stopped speaking. We both listened. The sound faded, replaced by the distant roar of the falls, steady and unchanging. My skin prickled, a thin line of cold tracing down my arms. "Don't go looking," he finished quietly. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps swallowed almost immediately by the darkness. I stood there longer than I meant to, lantern humming beside me, trying to convince myself that I'd just met an overzealous volunteer with a flair for drama. Camp hosts see accidents. They see lost hikers, drunk tourists, bears where bears shouldn't be. Maybe he'd had a bad night once and never let it go. That's what I told myself as I locked the van and climbed inside. By 11:30 p.m., the campground was completely still. Not even the insects had returned. The air felt heavier, damp pressing against the windows, carrying that same metallic smell stronger now like blood diluted in rainwater. I checked my phone. No signal. The falls seemed louder. At 11:47, I heard the first knock. It was soft, polite almost. Knuckles against metal, 3 taps, spaced evenly apart. I held my breath. The camp host's voice echoed in my head, "Don't answer." And I waited, listening for footsteps, for laughter, for anything that would explain it away. Nothing. At 11:56 p.m., the knock came again. This time it wasn't on the door. It was on the rear panel, right beside where I was lying. And then a voice, low, careful, and wrong in a way I couldn't explain, said my name. I hadn't told anyone my name. I didn't move when the voice said my name. I didn't even breathe. The sound didn't come from a single point. It seemed to slide along the side of the van, as if whoever spoke was leaning close, mouth hovering inches from the cold metal skin. The voice was male, but thin, stretched, like it had been practiced in a place where language wasn't meant to survive. "Ethan," it said again, softer this time, patient. My pulse hammered so hard I felt it in my teeth. I pressed my palm flat against the mattress, grounding myself in the familiar hum of the van, the refrigerator clicking on, the faint electrical whine I'd heard 1,000 nights before. I told myself this was a prank, a drunk camper, someone who'd overheard my name earlier. There were explanations if I stacked them carefully enough. Another knock followed. Not knuckles this time, fingertips, dragging slightly, leaving a faint squeal as they traced the metal. "Hey," the voice said. "Camp host sent me." That was when fear slid from my chest into my gut and stayed there. The camp host hadn't said my name. He hadn't said anything about sending anyone. And the idea of him, pale, shaking, sending someone at midnight felt wrong in a way that went deeper than logic. It felt like a lie that knew it was a lie. I reached slowly for my phone, not to call anyone. I still had no signal, but for the comfort of its glow. The screen lit the inside of the van in harsh blue, throwing shadows that didn't sit right, stretching too long across the cabinets. Outside, something shifted. Gravel crunched just once, right near the rear bumper. "Door's locked," the voice said, conversational. "That's okay, I can wait." Time thickened. Seconds dragged like they were being pulled backward. I stared at the door, at the thin seam of rubber where outside met inside, imagining fingers slipping through, nails bending the wrong way to fit. I didn't answer. I didn't make a sound. Eventually the presence moved. Footsteps, if that's what they were, circled the van slowly, too slowly, stopping at each window, pausing, listening. When it reached the driver's side, the smell hit me again, stronger now. Wet iron, rotting leaves, something animal and old. "Ethan," it whispered, right beside my ear. I jerked back, slamming into the cabinet, pain flaring through my shoulder. The sound had come from inside the van. I scrambled upright, heart screaming, eyes scanning every corner. Nothing, just my breath, ragged and loud, fogging the air. The whisper had faded, leaving behind a pressure like the echo of a hand pressed against glass. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was gone. No footsteps, no voice, no movement. The forest exhaled. I waited a long time before I dared to move. When I finally did, I checked every lock twice, then a third time, hands shaking so badly I had to brace my wrists against the counter. Everything was sealed, nothing disturbed. At some point, exhaustion crept in, heavy and unavoidable. Fear burns energy fast. I lay back down, fully clothed, keys clutched in my fist, every nerve tuned to the dark. Sleep came in fragments. I dreamed of knocking that never stopped. I woke just before dawn to a gray, colorless light seeping through the curtains. My mouth tasted like metal. My body felt wrong, heavy, sluggish, like I'd spent the night underwater. For a moment I wondered if the whole thing had been a stress dream, the product of too many miles alone. But when I sat up, I saw the marks. Along the rear panel, just beneath the window, faint streaks marred the paint. 5 of them. Parallel. Too evenly spaced to be branches. The metal beneath was slightly indented, like it had been pressed from the outside with deliberate force. I didn't pack slowly. I didn't make coffee. I didn't stretch or enjoy the morning air like I usually did. I threw everything into place with clumsy urgency, engine roaring to life louder than necessary. As I pulled out of Site 27, I noticed something else that made my hands tighten on the wheel. The camp host site, the one near the entrance, was empty. Not nobody's awake yet, empty. Stripped empty. No RV, no truck, no chair, no sign-in board. Even the fire ring looked unused. Cold ash scattered like it had never been lit. A ranger truck was parked nearby, 2 uniformed officers standing beside it. I rolled down my window, gravel crunching too loudly as I stopped. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where's the camp host?" They exchanged a look. The older one frowned slightly. "There wasn't a host scheduled last night." I laughed, sharp and involuntary. "That's not possible. He came to my site, warned me to leave." The younger ranger shook his head slowly. "Sir, the host position's been vacant for weeks. Last one quit mid-season." My stomach dropped. "What happened to him?" I asked. The older ranger sighed, rubbing his jaw. He claimed something was coming into the campground after midnight. Said it knew people's names. We figured stress, sleep deprivation. He left in the middle of the night and never came back for his stuff. I thought of the pale face, the trembling hands, the way he'd looked past me into the trees. "Did you find him?" I asked. The ranger met my eyes. "No." The falls roared behind us, louder than they should have been. I left Blackwater Falls without another word, tires spitting gravel as I crossed the park boundary. I didn't stop driving for hours. I didn't look back. For a long time, I told myself that was the end of it, that whatever prowled those woods stayed there, bound by place and time. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm parked somewhere quiet and the world thins out again, I hear it. 3 soft knocks. Patient. Waiting. I thought leaving Blackwater Falls would loosen something inside me. I believed distance could scrub the night clean, that miles of highway and new scenery would sand the memory down and into something manageable. That's how I'd always handled fear before. Drive through it, outpace it, leave it pinned to a place on a map. But fear doesn't work that way when it learns your name. The first night after Blackwater, I parked at a well-lit rest area in Ohio. Fluorescent lamps hummed overhead, casting everything in a sterile, almost comforting glow. Families slept in minivans. Truckers idled nearby, diesel engines rumbling like distant thunder. I told myself this was safe, civilized, normal. Still, I didn't sleep. Every sound threaded itself through me. The hiss of air brakes, the pop of cooling engines, a door closing too softly. Each noise pulled me halfway out of my skin before I could stop it. Around 11:56 p.m., I checked my phone without meaning to. The number stared back at me like a dare. I laughed at myself then, quiet, bitter. You're letting it follow you, I thought. You're giving it power. That was the lie I leaned on for weeks. I kept driving west, back roads when I could, state parks and national forests when I felt brave enough. On the surface, nothing else happened. No voices, no knocks. But something fundamental had shifted. The woods no longer felt neutral. They felt observant. I started noticing patterns. Campgrounds where the insects went silent too early, sites where the air smelled faintly of rust no matter the weather. I'd pull in, feel that pressure behind my eyes, and leave without unpacking. Other times I stayed and spent the whole night awake, jaw clenched, keys in hand, listening for a sound that never came. The worst part wasn't the fear itself. It was the doubt. I questioned every instinct, every urge to lock up early, every shiver that ran through me for no clear reason. I argued with myself constantly, caught between the man I'd been, the one who trusted experience, and the one Blackwater had carved into me, raw and alert and never fully at rest. Months passed, autumn bled into winter. By the time snow dusted the higher elevations, I found myself in northern Arizona, parked at a dispersed site miles from the nearest paved road. I told myself I chose it because it was beautiful, red rock rising against a star-heavy sky, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to prove something to myself, that the woods didn't own me, that I could still sleep under open sky without flinching at every sound. The night was cold enough to sting. My breath fogged the air inside the van, and the metal felt brittle, contracting with sharp little pings as the temperature dropped. I lay wrapped in a blanket, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind thread its way through the rocks. Just before midnight, the smell returned. Faint at first, easy to ignore, then stronger. Wet iron, old leaves. My stomach tightened. I sat up slowly, heart thudding, and checked the locks, all secure. The desert was silent outside, vast and empty in a way that should have been comforting. No trees here, no dense forest to hide in. At 11:56 p.m., the wind stopped. The silence pressed in from all sides, heavy and deliberate. I held my breath, every muscle coiled, waiting for the sound I'd come to dread. It didn't come. Instead, something brushed the side of the van. Not a knock, a drag, slow and exploratory, like fingertips testing a surface they didn't quite understand. I whispered no without meaning to. The brushing moved toward the rear panel, following the same path as before. My chest burned, lungs screaming for air, but I stayed silent, eyes locked on the thin line of the door seam. Then a voice, thin, careful, impossibly familiar, spoke from just outside. "You left?" it said. The words weren't an accusation, they were an observation. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the urge to respond, to deny it, to demand answers. The camp host's warning echoed back through me, sharper now with hindsight. "Don't go looking." "I waited," the voice continued. "This isn't where you're supposed to be." A surge of panic broke through my restraint. I grabbed the keys, engine roaring to life so suddenly it felt violent. Headlights flared, washing the desert in stark white. The brushing stopped. The smell vanished. I didn't see anything when I threw the van into reverse, tires spitting gravel as I turned back toward the road. The desert stretched out empty and indifferent, stars cold and distant above me. I drove until dawn. That was the night I stopped pretending this was about a place. Whatever had spoken to me at Blackwater Falls wasn't bound to the forest or the park boundary. It was tied to something else, something quieter, more personal. My willingness to ignore the small alarms. My habit of staying when everything in me said leave. I sold the Vanagon the following spring. People thought I was crazy. That van had been my home, my anchor, my proof that I could live light and free. But every time I sat behind that wheel, I felt watched, chosen, like the vehicle itself had become a marker. I still camp, I still love the road, but I leave early now. I listen harder. When a place feels wrong, I don't argue with it. I don't wait for evidence, because some things don't need proof. Some things only need permission. And the moment you ignore that quiet voice telling you to go, something else steps in, patient, persistent, already knowing your name. I don't mark anniversaries anymore, but my body does. Every August, without fail, something in me tightens, sleep thins, sounds sharpen. I start waking up just before midnight with the same sensation I felt that first night at Blackwater Falls, the sense that the world has leaned slightly out of alignment, that something has noticed me again. I wish I could say the encounters stopped after Arizona, that selling the van closed a door. It didn't. What it did was change the rules. Now the warnings come earlier. A campground that smells wrong before sunset. A trailhead where my chest tightens for no logical reason. A host who avoids eye contact, who says nothing but lingers too long after dark. I listen to those signs now. I leave before the forest decides to speak louder. But once, only once, I didn't. It was early fall, 2 years after Blackwater. I was traveling through eastern Oregon, wide land, open sky, nowhere for shadows to hide. I pulled into a small, nearly forgotten campground run by the county. No dramatic warnings, no pale host, just a hand-painted sign and 6 empty sites. I told myself I was being careful. I parked close to the road. I set up quickly. I stayed alert. The unease came anyway. Not sharp, not panicked, just a low internal resistance, like my body leaning back while my mind insisted on moving forward. I ignored it. I cooked dinner. I watched the light fade. I told myself fear only wins if you feed it. At 11:40 p.m., the temperature dropped hard, too fast. The air went brittle, biting at my lungs. The smell crept in, not strong, not obvious, but unmistakable to me now. I didn't check the time. I didn't need to. The knock came at 11:56. This time, it wasn't on metal. It was on wood. 3 taps, slow and deliberate, on the picnic table beside my tent. I sat frozen, staring at the thin fabric wall inches from my face, listening to my heart try to claw its way out of my chest. The sound came again, closer now, knuckles rapping against the tent pole. "Ethan," the voice said gently, kindly, like someone trying not to scare a skittish animal. I felt something shift then, not panic, not denial, but clarity. I finally understood what the camp host had known. This thing wasn't hunting, it was correcting. It didn't chase everyone, only the ones who stayed when they were told, by instinct, by environment, by quiet internal warning, to leave. It wasn't bound to forests or vans or campgrounds. It followed hesitation. It fed on the moment you decided you knew better than the signal meant to save you. The knock came again. I didn't answer. I didn't run. I did something harder. I listened to the small, steady voice inside me that had survived every mile, every mistake, every rationalization. The voice I'd drowned out for years with confidence and pride and the need to prove I wasn't afraid. I spoke aloud, my voice shaking but real. "You don't get to choose for me." Silence pressed in so hard my ears rang. Then the smell faded. The pressure lifted. By morning, the campground looked exactly as it should, empty, ordinary, harmless. But I packed anyway. Not in fear, in respect. Because the lesson wasn't about monsters in the woods or voices in the dark. It was about this. The land always tells you the truth first, in temperature shifts, in silence, in the way your chest tightens for no reason you can explain. Most people talk themselves out of that truth. They wait for proof. They wait for knocking. I don't. I leave early. I trust the unease. I respect the warning, even when it comes without words, and I've never heard my name spoken in the dark again. But sometimes on quiet nights, far from campgrounds, far from trees, I still wake just before midnight, heart racing, listening to the world hold its breath, because I know now some things don't follow you to harm you. They follow to see if you've finally learned how to walk away. The first knock didn't scare me, because it came from a place that shouldn't have been able to make a sound at all. I remember that moment with a clarity that still tightens my chest years later. The RV was completely still, parked beneath a ceiling of Appalachian stars at Watauga State Park in West Virginia. No wind, no rain, no late-night campers wandering past. Just silence so deep it felt padded, like the world had been wrapped in thick felt and set aside. I was sitting at the small dinette of my old Volkswagen Rialta, hands around a chipped enamel mug that had long since gone cold, listening to the tick-pop of cooling metal after a long drive. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 36 that spring, living out of Morgantown, West Virginia, and RV camping was how I kept my head above water after a messy divorce and a job that hollowed me out one spreadsheet at a time. The Rialta wasn't big, barely more than a camper van, but it was mine. It smelled like coffee grounds, pine cleaner, and the faint must of damp boots. It was a controlled space, predictable, safe. At least that's what I told myself. Watauga had been a spontaneous choice. I'd driven south after work on a Friday, chasing that familiar itch, the one that told me if I didn't leave town, I'd suffocate in routine. The campground was quiet for May. Too quiet, maybe, but I rationalized that as a blessing. Fewer neighbors, fewer distractions. Just me, the forest, and the low hum of the RV settling into night. The storage compartment was directly beneath the dinette bench where I sat. An exterior compartment, locked, metal latch. Inside it, leveling blocks, a folded tarp, a spare hose, and a box of tools that rattled if you hit a pothole too hard. Nothing alive, nothing loose enough to knock. The sound came again. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. Not from outside the RV, from underneath me. At first, my brain refused to accept the geometry of it. Sound does strange things in the woods, I told myself. Echoes, animals brushing past, maybe a raccoon had climbed onto the step and bumped the frame. That happens sometimes. I forced a laugh, the kind you use when you don't want to admit you're uneasy, and took a sip from the mug before remembering it was empty. Then I felt it, a vibration, through the bench, through the soles of my boots resting on the linoleum floor. A dull, transmitted pressure, like someone knocking on a coffin lid from the inside. I froze. Every sense sharpened all at once, as if my body had decided to skip denial and go straight to readiness. The RV seemed to contract around me. The overhead cabinets creaked softly as the temperature dropped. Somewhere outside, something moved through the underbrush, leaves whispering against each other in a way that sounded uncomfortably like breath. I leaned forward, slowly, pressing my palm flat against the bench cushion. The vinyl was cool, solid. No movement. My heart was beating too fast now, loud enough that I wondered if I was imagining the knocking entirely, if it was just my pulse pounding in my ears. Then it happened again. Knock. Closer somehow, as if whatever was making the sound had adjusted its position. My mouth went dry. I pulled my hand back and stood, the small space forcing me to straighten carefully so I didn't hit my head. I told myself this was exactly the kind of thing people misinterpret when they camp alone. Fear fills in gaps. The mind invents threats when it's bored or tired or lonely. I had driven 4 hours after a full workday. I was wired, overstimulated. Still, I reached for the flashlight mounted by the door. The beam cut through the RV's interior, painting harsh white edges on familiar shapes. The sink, the stove, the narrow aisle leading back to the bed. Everything looked normal. Too normal. That was the problem. There was no visible source for what I'd heard. I crouched and pressed my ear close to the bench. Silence. I waited, counting my breaths. 1, 2, 3, knock. This time it was unmistakable. Directly below my ear. Not a thump, not a scrape. Knuckles, or something mimicking them. A memory surfaced then, unwanted and sharp. My grandfather's voice, years earlier, telling me about old Appalachian tricks, about how some animals learn to make sounds they shouldn't, about how you never answered noises at night unless you could see what made them. I'd rolled my eyes back then, chalking it up to mountain superstition. Standing there in that RV, alone in the dark, I wasn't so sure. I backed away and sat on the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel like it could anchor me. The forest outside felt closer now, pressing against the thin aluminum walls. The smell inside the RV shifted subtly. Not bad. Not exactly, but different. Damp. Earthy, as if something wet had been sealed in too long. The knocking stopped. That scared me more than the sound itself. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. My muscles ached from holding tension. I considered starting the engine, driving out right then, but pride crept in. The same stubborn voice that had kept me in a failing marriage too long, that insisted leaving was the same as losing. "You're fine," I whispered, the words sounding small in the enclosed space. "You're just tired." I stood again and walked to the door. The handle was cold in my hand. I flipped on the exterior light, flooding the campsite with a yellow glow. Through the window, I could see the picnic table, the fire ring, the gravel pad, nothing moving, no shadows where they shouldn't be. I cracked the door open. The night air rushed in, cool and heavy with the smell of moss and wet bark. The forest loomed just beyond the reach of the light, trees packed so tightly they looked like a wall. I scanned the ground, the underside of the RV, the storage compartment door beneath the bench. It was closed, locked, untouched. I knelt and pressed my ear against the metal panel. Nothing. Relief washed over me in a weak, dizzying wave. I straightened, feeling foolish, adrenaline still buzzing through my veins, with nowhere to go. I told myself I'd imagined it. That was the story I chose because it was the easiest one to live with. I closed the door and locked it, then double-checked the storage latch from inside, something I'd never bothered with before. The lock was secure. Solid. I lay down on the narrow bed at the back, boots still on, flashlight resting on my chest. Sleep felt impossible, but exhaustion has a way of dragging you under whether you agree or not. My thoughts drifted. looping around the sound, replaying it from different angles, trying to file it away as harmless. Just as my eyes finally closed. Knock. Not from below. From inside the RV. From the storage compartment wall, inches from my head. My eyes snapped open, heart slamming so hard it hurt. The knocking came again, faster now, irregular, like something was testing different spots, learning the space. And beneath the sound, so faint I almost missed it, was something else, a low, uneven breathing. Not mine. The breathing stopped the moment I held mine. That detail still unsettles me more than the knocking ever did. Not that there was breathing, but that it responded, like whatever was on the other side of that thin wall knew when I was listening. I lay there in the dark, flashlight clenched so tightly, my hand began to cramp, staring at the seam where the storage compartment wall met the RV's interior paneling. The knocking had left a pressure in the air, a kind of afterimage, the way thunder does when it's already gone, but your body hasn't caught up yet. I whispered, barely moving my lips, "Hello?" The word sounded obscene the second it left my mouth, too loud, too inviting. Nothing answered, no knock, no breath, just the slow tick of the RV cooling further as the night deepened. Somewhere far off, an owl called, low and wavering, the sound bending strangely between the trees. I'd heard owls before. This one sounded strained, like it was forcing the noise through something tight in its throat. I sat up slowly, vertebra by vertebra, until my back pressed against the wall. The RV felt smaller now, like the walls had inched inward while I wasn't looking. I tried to reason through it. Storage compartments aren't airtight. Sound can travel. An animal could have crawled underneath, gotten trapped, panicked. But animals don't knock. I slid off the bed and stood, careful to distribute my weight evenly so the floor wouldn't creak. The flashlight beam shook as I aimed it at the wall. Up close, I could see scuff marks I didn't remember noticing before. Thin, pale scratches in the faux wood paneling. Shallow, irregular, like something hard had dragged across it. My stomach dropped. I told myself they'd always been there, wear and tear. The Rialto was nearly 20 years old, but that explanation felt thin, and my body rejected it outright. My skin prickled, a warning flare I'd learned too late in life not to ignore. The smell was stronger now. Damp metal, old water, and underneath it something sour-sweet like rotting leaves packed into a closed space. I gagged and covered my nose, the movement sudden enough that the RV groaned softly in protest. The knocking resumed. This time it wasn't rhythmic, it was frantic. Bang, bang, scrape, bang. The wall shuddered with each impact, the vibration traveling straight through my ribs. I staggered back, heart hammering, the sound filling the RV so completely there was no room for thought. Panic rose fast and hot, overriding logic, screaming one clear directive: get out. I rushed to the door, fumbling with the lock. My fingers felt thick, clumsy. The knocking intensified, moving along the wall as if whatever was inside the storage compartment was shifting its weight, following me. "Stop!" I shouted, the word tearing out of me raw and useless. The lock clicked. I yanked the door open. Cold night air slammed into me, carrying the forest's breath with it, wet soil, pine resin, something animal. I stumbled down the steps and turned, shining the flashlight along the RV's exterior, my pulse roaring in my ears. The storage compartment door bulged outward. Not much, just enough to notice. The metal bowed slightly, like someone was leaning against it from the inside. I stood frozen, every survival instinct at war with disbelief. My brain screamed that this wasn't possible, that I was misinterpreting shadows and fear. But my eyes didn't care about what was possible. The bulge shifted. A dull thud followed, then another. The latch rattled, vibrating against the frame. Whatever was inside wasn't just knocking anymore. It was testing. I backed away slowly, scanning the campsite for anyone else. Lights, movement, anything human. But the campground remained eerily still, the other sites dark and empty, trees standing like silent witnesses who had no intention of intervening. The forest felt closer again, pressing in from all sides, hemming me between itself and the RV like a trap. "Help!" I yelled, the word cracking. It vanished into the trees without echo, swallowed whole. The knocking stopped. For one suspended moment, everything was still. Even the night insects seemed to pause, as if the woods itself was holding its breath. Then the latch snapped. The storage compartment door flew open with a metallic shriek, slamming down hard enough to bounce once against the RV's side. I screamed and stumbled backward, nearly falling over the picnic table. My flashlight beam darted wildly, catching only darkness inside the compartment at first. Then something moved. A shape unfolded from the shadows, low to the ground. Too low. It wasn't an animal the way my mind wanted it to be. It moved wrong, jerky, uncoordinated, like its joints didn't agree on which direction to bend. Pale skin caught the light, smeared with grime. Hair hung in wet-looking strands over a face that turned toward me with unsettling slowness. Its eyes reflected the beam dully, not bright, like an animal's. Human eyes. It inhaled deep and shuddering, chest expanding unnaturally, and when it exhaled, the sound was the same uneven breathing I'd heard through the wall. I bolted. I don't remember making the decision. My body moved on its own, legs pumping as I ran toward the driver's side door, keys already in my hand. I fumbled them once, twice. The figure scrambling out of the compartment behind me, limbs scraping against metal. "Please," it croaked. The word hit me harder than the knocking ever had. I froze for half a second, just long enough to turn my head. It was standing now, swaying slightly, taller than it had looked on the ground. Its face was gaunt, hollowed out, eyes too big for the skull they sat in. A beard clung in patchy clumps along its jaw. It wore torn jeans and a jacket that might once have been green, now stained dark with moisture and dirt. Human. Every instinct screamed danger, but another voice rose up alongside it, the one shaped by guilt, by the fear of becoming someone who turns away when another person is desperate. That hesitation nearly got me killed. It lunged forward with a sudden burst of speed, hand reaching, fingers splayed. I saw the nails then, blackened, cracked, some missing entirely. I ripped the driver's door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as its hand struck the window. The glass rattled violently, spiderwebbing with stress lines but holding. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine coughed once, twice. "Come on," I sobbed, pressing my forehead to the steering wheel. The knocking returned, on the door, on the side panel, on the hood. Desperate. Furious. The RV rocked with the force of it. The engine caught. I floored it. Gravel sprayed as the Rialta lurched forward, the figure stumbling back, arms flailing. I didn't look again. I couldn't. I tore down the campground road, branches whipping past, heart in my throat, tears blurring my vision. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, tires screaming as I turned, heading anywhere but there. I drove for nearly an hour before pulling over, hands shaking so badly I had to sit on them to make them stop. Dawn was still hours away. The forest along the road looked no less ominous, but distance had dulled the immediacy of the terror just enough for thought to creep back in. I never reported it. I didn't know how. What would I say? That a man had been hiding inside my RV's storage compartment without my knowledge? That I'd camped alone, left it unattended long enough for something like that to happen? The truth I had to face was harder. I'd ignored my instincts long before the knocking started. I'd chosen isolation over awareness, comfort over caution. I'd treated the campground like a backdrop instead of a living, unpredictable place. I sold the Rialta that summer. I still camp. Still love the road, the quiet, the way the country opens up when you let it. But I never camp alone anymore. I never ignore sounds at night. And I never assume that because something shouldn't be possible, it isn't. Because sometimes the scariest thing about the wilderness isn't that you're alone, it's that you never truly are. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that night. Not real sleep, anyway. My body would shut down in short, violent bursts, 10 minutes here, 20 there, before jolting awake at the slightest sound. A truck downshifting on the highway, wind rattling a signpost, the soft thump of my own heartbeat in my ears. Every noise dragged me back to Watoga, back to 12:29 a.m., back to the sound of something knocking from a place that should have been empty. I parked the RV in a rest area just outside of Summersville as dawn finally broke, the sky bruised purple and gray. I remember sitting there with the engine off, forehead resting against the steering wheel, watching fog lift off the trees like the forest was exhaling. My hands smelled like metal and sweat. No matter how many times I wiped them on my jeans, the smell stayed. When the sun finally rose high enough to feel real, I forced myself out of the driver's seat and walked around the RV. The storage compartment door hung crooked on its hinges. The latch was bent inward, warped like it had been bitten. There were marks along the metal, scratches, deep this time, gouged in frantic arcs that caught the light. Proof. Solid, undeniable proof that it hadn't been a nightmare. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at those marks, because as long as I didn't look inside, the night was still contained, still behind me. Eventually, I opened the compartment. It was empty. No tarp out of place, no tools disturbed, no sign that anyone or anything had been there long enough to leave belongings behind. Just the stale, damp smell lingering like a memory that refused to fade. That absence did something to me. It robbed me of the comfort of explanation. If there had been a sleeping bag, a bottle, anything human left behind, I could have framed the experience neatly. A desperate man hiding, trapped by circumstance. Terrifying, yes, but understandable. Instead, all I had were marks and memories. I drove home in silence, radio off, windows cracked just enough to let fresh air cycle through. Every mile put distance between me and the park, but the feeling followed, coiled tight in my chest. By the time I pulled into my driveway in Morgantown, I felt like I was carrying Watauga State Park inside me. The weeks that followed were worse than the night itself. Fear doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. I'd be at work staring at my screen when a faint tapping sound, someone typing too hard on a keyboard, would send my pulse spiking. I started sitting with my back to walls. I stopped wearing headphones. I caught myself scanning reflections in dark windows, checking shadows under parked cars. At night, I lay in bed, listening to my house settle, every creak magnified. My mind replayed the moment that man said please over and over, twisting it, interrogating it. Was it a plea for help, a trap? Did it even matter now that I'd seen what hesitation could cost? The guilt surprised me more than the fear. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that I'd survived, that my responsibility was to myself. But guilt isn't rational. It doesn't care about logic or self-defense. It just asks questions you can't answer. Who was he? How long had he been there? Had he chosen my RV, or was it chance? And the question that haunted me most, creeping in during the quietest moments, how long had he been listening to me before I heard him? I stopped camping for a while after that. The Rialta sat unused in my driveway, a silent accusation. When I finally decided to sell it, I felt relief so sharp it bordered on grief. Letting it go felt like shedding a skin I'd outgrown, or maybe one that had failed to protect me. But the road has a way of calling you back. By the following spring, the itch returned. Not the reckless, escape-driven urge I used to feel, but something deeper. A need to confront what had happened instead of running from it. I bought a different rig, a newer model, sturdier, with better locks and less charm. Practical, controlled, and I made rules. I don't camp alone anymore, ever. Even if it means driving farther or paying more, I choose populated campgrounds. I introduce myself to my neighbors. I learn faces, routines, patterns. I trust my instincts now, especially when they tell me something feels off before I can articulate why. I also changed how I listen. That might sound strange, but it's true. I don't just hear sounds anymore. I evaluate them. I ask where they come from, how they travel, whether they make sense in the space I'm in. And when they don't, I don't rationalize them away. I act. Because the lesson Watauga taught me wasn't just about danger. It was about denial. I'd gone there carrying emotional baggage I didn't want to unpack. Loneliness, pride, a stubborn belief that solitude equaled safety. The forest didn't create that fear. It exposed it, pressed on it, whispered until I was forced to listen. Sometimes people talk about nature as if it's neutral, peaceful, healing. It isn't. Nature doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care about your need for quiet or escape. It reflects what you bring into it, magnifies your blind spots, and tests the stories you tell yourself about control. That night, I told myself I was alone. I wasn't, and that truth extends far beyond campgrounds and RVs. It applies to the roads we travel, the choices we make, the warning signs we ignore, because acknowledging them would require change. I still think about that man, about the way his eyes reflected my flashlight, dull and human and desperate. I don't know what happened to him after I drove away. I don't know if he survived that night or the nights that followed. What I do know is this: fear isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's the last honest voice you hear before something irreversible happens. If you camp, if you travel, if you seek quiet places to outrun noise inside yourself, listen closely, not just to the woods, but to the unease that rises before the danger becomes obvious. Don't wait for the knocking to get loud enough to scare you. By then, it's already been there for a while, listening, waiting. And the most terrifying realization of all isn't that something was knocking from inside my RV storage, it's that I ignored the silence that came before it. The fog didn't roll in that night. It arrived with intention, as if it had been waiting for us to stop moving. I remember thinking that as I shut off the engine of my old Volkswagen camper, the familiar rattle dying into a thick, padded silence. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 38 then, and I'd been camping long enough to trust patterns, weather patterns, animal patterns, human ones. Fog, in my experience, was careless. It drifted, lifted, burned off. This fog pressed. It leaned its weight against the windows like a held breath that refused to let go. Canaan Valley had always felt like a place caught between decisions. Mountain air unsure whether to fall or rise, forests that swallowed sound instead of echoing it. I'd chosen the campground because it was nearly empty in November. Off-season camping was my way of keeping the world at arm's length. Fewer people meant fewer variables. That was the lie I told myself. The Volkswagen was my refuge. Beige interior, curtains that smelled faintly of dust and campfire smoke, the gentle hum of the heater fighting the cold. I parked near the tree line, not too deep, not too exposed. That balance had always worked before. Outside, the fog slid low across the ground, thick enough that my headlights cut tunnels through it instead of distance. Shapes formed and softened. A stump looked like a crouched figure. A tree trunk bent into something hunched and waiting. I laughed it off because that's what you do when your instincts speak too early. It was just after midnight when the fog truly settled. The temperature dropped fast, cold seeping up through the floorboards, finding the soles of my feet. I pulled on thicker socks, brewed coffee even though I didn't need it, just to feel the ritual of normalcy. The smell grounded me. Bitter, warm, familiar. Outside, the fog muted everything. No wind, no insects, not even the distant rush of the river I knew was there. Silence like that doesn't calm you. It watches you test it. I just started to drift when the first sound came. Not loud, not sharp, a soft contact, fingertips brushing glass. I froze, staring at the fog-blurred window above the sink. My mind offered explanations faster than my body could accept them. Branches, condensation popping, thermal shift. I stayed still, counting breaths, listening. Nothing followed. The heater clicked on, loud in the quiet, and I cursed under my breath for jumping. That was my mistake. Deciding too early that fear was an overreaction. Around 3:40 a.m., I woke again. This time already tense, like my body had never fully relaxed. The fog was thicker somehow, pressed so close to the windows that the outside world felt erased. My phone read 4:18 a.m. when the second sound came. A knock. Not random. Not accidental. 3 slow taps on the side panel of the van. I sat up, heart hammering, the taste of old coffee sour in my mouth. The knock came again, same rhythm, same deliberate spacing. Whoever or whatever was outside knew exactly where I was. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe properly. I waited for a voice, a request, a cough. Campgrounds had rules. Rangers knocked. People got lost. But there was no voice. Just the fog, thick enough to swallow the moon, clinging to the glass like breath held too long. Then came the smell. Damp earth, rotting leaves, and something else. Sharp, metallic, wrong. It seeped in through the vents, crawling into my lungs, turning each breath into a conscious effort. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight, the beam slicing uselessly into white nothingness when I cracked the curtain. I saw nothing, but the sense of being seen was immediate and overwhelming, like a pressure behind the eyes. The fog didn't swirl or part. It stayed still, as if it didn't need to move to observe. I told myself it was an animal. Deer sometimes nudged vehicles. Bears were rare but possible. My rational mind clung to that explanation like a lifeline, even as the third knock landed, closer to the driver's door this time. Tap, tap, pause. I whispered, "Go away," to no one, to everything. The fog shifted then, not clearing, not lifting, but compressing, shapes forming within it that lingered just long enough to make my brain fill in details. A shoulder, a head, too tall, too still. Panic bloomed hot and fast, but I fought it, because panic gets you hurt. I stayed inside, locked the doors again even though I knew they already were, and shut off the interior light. Darkness felt safer than exposure. That's when the scratching started. Slow, methodical, along the side of the van, like nails testing paint. I covered my mouth to keep from making a sound, tears blurring my vision as every instinct screamed at me to run, and every rational thought told me to stay put. Minutes stretched. The scratching moved, circled, stopped. The fog outside seemed to pulse, thick enough now that the windows bowed slightly under its weight. I don't know how long it lasted. Time lost, meaning somewhere between fear and disbelief. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. No footsteps retreating, no rustle of leaves, just silence, deeper than before, heavier. I stayed awake until dawn, muscles locked, senses raw. When the fog finally thinned enough for the trees to reappear, they looked closer than they should have been, like the forest had leaned in during the night and hadn't fully retreated. I left that morning without breakfast, without packing properly, tires crunching over frost as I drove away. At the ranger station, I mentioned the knocking, the fog, the smell. The man behind the desk didn't ask follow-up questions. He just nodded once and said, "That valley holds things when the air gets heavy." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. Because some places don't chase you. They wait. The fog followed the road for miles, thin at first, then thickening again as if it resented my leaving. I kept my hands locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes burning from a night without sleep. The Volkswagen's engine hummed steady, dependable, almost defiant against the quiet oppression pressing in from all sides. Trees slid past in ghosted silhouettes, their tops severed by the low cloud cover. Every so often, the fog would surge forward, swallowing the road entirely, forcing me to slow to a crawl. It felt deliberate, not random weather, but timing, like it wanted me to notice it was still there. I told myself I was projecting. That fear had rewired my perception, that the valley had gotten under my skin, and now my brain was doing what brains do when they're exhausted and overstimulated. Pattern-seeking, exaggerating, inventing meaning where none existed. I repeated that thought like a mantra until the smell came back. Not inside the van this time. Outside. I rolled the window down just a crack, needing cold air to stay awake, and it hit me immediately. Wet leaves, iron, something old and stagnant. My stomach tightened. The smell wasn't drifting randomly. It was strongest when the fog thickened, fading when the road briefly cleared. My skin prickled with the awareness that this wasn't about location anymore. This was about proximity. I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw headlights behind me, dim, diffused, swallowed by fog. Relief surged before dread crushed it. The lights didn't move like a vehicle. They stayed perfectly aligned, perfectly distant, hovering just above where the road should have been. I blinked. Gone. My pulse thundered in my ears. I laughed once, sharp and brittle, the sound alien inside the van. "Get it together," I muttered. Sleep deprivation. That's all. Hallucinations happen when you push too hard, stay up too long. I'd read about it. I'd even experienced mild versions before. shadows that jumped, sounds that weren't there, but hallucinations don't knock, they don't scratch, they don't follow. The fog thinned as the road climbed, and eventually I reached a stretch where the trees gave way to open field. Gray light spread across the sky, weak but welcome. My shoulders loosened for the first time since the night before. Whatever had happened back there belonged to the valley. I was beyond it now. That was another lie. I stopped at a gas station just after sunrise, the kind that looked like it had been forgotten by time. 2 pumps, flickering sign, a diner attached that smelled like burnt grease and old coffee. I parked close to the building, needing the illusion of human presence, and stepped out into air that was crisp but wrong. Too still. No birds, no distant traffic. Inside, the diner was empty except for an older woman behind the counter and a man seated in a corner booth, his back to me. The bell above the door rang too loud. Both of them looked up at the same time. Their eyes went past my face, past my shoulders, to the windows behind me. The woman's smile faltered just enough for me to notice. "Rough night?" she asked, already pouring coffee I hadn't ordered. I followed her gaze, heart sinking. Outside, the fog had crept into the parking lot, coiling low around the tires of my van like something alive. It hadn't crossed the road. It had come directly to me. "I camped in Canaan Valley," I said, voice hoarse. The man in the booth stiffened. He turned slowly, revealing a face lined deep with age and something else, wariness, recognition. "November?" he asked. I nodded. He exhaled through his nose. "You shouldn't have stayed past sundown." The woman set the coffee down harder than necessary. "You see anyone?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "No." I felt them. Neither of them challenged that phrasing. "You leave anything behind?" the man asked. The question caught me off guard. "What?" "Did you take anything?" he pressed. "Wood, stones, antlers, anything that didn't belong to you." I thought of the fog pressed against the windows, the shapes, the knocking. "No." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. "Good." I didn't stay long. Fear had sharpened my instincts, and they were screaming at me to keep moving. As I walked back to the van, the fog receded just slightly, enough to reveal damp footprints near my tires. Bare, too long, pointed inward toward the undercarriage. I didn't inspect further. I didn't linger. I got in, locked the doors, and drove until the gas needle dipped dangerously low and my nerves felt flayed raw. The fog finally vanished sometime late that morning, breaking apart under stronger sunlight. Blue sky appeared, ordinary and harmless. The world resumed its noise, traffic, wind, distant voices. By the time I crossed into the next state, I'd almost convinced myself the worst was over. That night, I parked at a rest stop crowded with trucks and families, lights blazing, asphalt warm beneath my feet. I slept in the driver's seat, exhaustion finally winning. I dreamed of condensation forming on glass from the outside, of breath that wasn't mine. I woke to the sound of tapping, not on metal, on glass. Soft, patient, close to my ear. I bolted upright, heart in my throat, eyes darting to the window inches from my face. The glass was fogged, not from the cold outside, but from something warm on the other side. A shape leaned close, close enough that I could see the distortion where its presence pressed against the fog. Not a face, not anything I could name, just the impression of attention. I screamed, lights snapped on, doors opened, voices shouted. The shape withdrew instantly, fog dissipating as if burned away by noise and witness. When I looked again, there was nothing there, just people staring at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. I drove home without stopping again, adrenaline carrying me the last 100 miles. For weeks afterward, I avoided campgrounds, avoided fog, avoided silence. I scrubbed the van until my hands cracked, trying to erase the memory of that smell, that pressure, that feeling of being chosen. It didn't matter. Sometimes, early in the morning, when the weather shifts just right, condensation still forms on the inside of my windows in patterns that don't match my breath. Sometimes, when fog rolls in thick and low, I feel that same weight in the air, that same quiet attention. I learned something in Canaan Valley, something every camper should understand, but few want to accept. Nature doesn't always warn you with violence. Sometimes it watches to see if you'll listen, and sometimes when you don't, it remembers you. I stopped calling it coincidence after the third morning. The first time, I blamed temperature changes. The second, stress. By the third time, I woke to fog clinging to the inside of my Volkswagen, thin, pearled moisture tracing shapes I hadn't breathed. I understood something had crossed a line I didn't know existed. I was home by then. Flat ground, familiar roads, a town that woke up loud and early with delivery trucks and barking dogs and the kind of noise that's supposed to keep things like this away. I parked the van in my driveway, slept in my own bed, told myself the trip was over. But fear doesn't end just because you change scenery. It adapts. The smell came back first, faint but unmistakable. Wet leaves after rain, even on dry mornings. That metallic edge like old pennies pressed between your teeth. I noticed it when I opened the van door, when I walked past the tree line at the edge of my property, when fog gathered low over the fields at dawn. Always with fog, never without it. I tried to rationalize again. Mold, residual scent clinging to fabric, memory imprinting smell where it didn't exist. I aired everything out, replaced filters, scrubbed until the beige interior looked new again. For a while it worked. Then the sounds started. Not knocking this time, not scratching. Footsteps, footsteps, slow, measured, always circling, always stopping just short of where I stood. The worst part wasn't the fear, it was the familiarity. The sense that whatever had noticed me in Canaan Valley had learned my rhythms. Learned when I slept lightly, learned when I was alone, learned when the fog would make me doubt myself just enough to hesitate. I started researching, not online forums full of speculation and thrill seekers, but old records, ranger logs, archived local papers. Canaan Valley appeared more often than I expected, usually buried in small paragraphs near the back. Missing hikers. Abandoned vehicles found intact, doors open, engines cold. Witness statements dismissed as confusion or hypothermia. One phrase appeared more than once, always attributed to locals, never explained. The fog holds its ground. I drove back in early December against every instinct screaming at me not to. Fear can either hollow you out or harden you into something deliberate. I needed answers more than comfort. I needed to know if this thing followed everyone, or if I'd done something to invite it. The campground was officially closed for the season. Snow dusted the ground in uneven patches, crunching under my boots. The fog wasn't there when I arrived, which somehow made it worse. Clear air felt like a held breath before impact. I parked in the same spot. That felt important. I waited until nightfall, sitting in the van with the engine off, heater silent, listening to the forest reclaim its voice. Wind whispered through branches. Something scurried in the undergrowth. Normal sounds. Real sounds. At 4:18 a.m., the fog came back. Not rolling in, rising. It seeped from the ground itself, thick and low, spreading outward in a perfect radius until the van sat at its center. The temperature dropped fast enough that my breath clouded instantly. My chest tightened with the weight of recognition. I didn't take anything, I said aloud, voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I didn't disrespect this place. The fog pressed closer, tendrils brushing the windows, the mirrors, the roof. Shapes formed again, clearer now, taller, closer. Not humanoid, but intentional, like outlines carved by absence rather than presence. The smell intensified, sharp enough to sting my eyes. "You watched me," I whispered. "That's all I did. I noticed you." The fog stilled. For the first time, I understood. This wasn't punishment, it was selection. Some places don't want to be conquered or explored. They want witnesses. They choose people who stay long enough, who listen deeply enough, who mistake quiet for emptiness. The fog wasn't angry. It was curious, and curiosity unchecked becomes possession. "I'm not yours," I said louder now. "I won't carry you with me." The pressure built instantly, crushing, suffocating. The van groaned as if under physical weight. The windows bowed inward. The shapes leaned closer, surrounding me completely, their attention absolute and overwhelming. Panic surged, but I didn't run. Instead, I did the one thing I hadn't done before. I left. Not driving, not escaping. I stepped out, Cold slammed into me, biting through layers, fog wrapping around my legs like water. The smell was everywhere now, thick and invasive. I could feel the ground beneath my boots vibrating, Ed, not from movement, but from intent. I acknowledge you, I said, voice shaking but unbroken. But I don't belong to you. I won't speak for you. I won't bring others here. The fog recoiled slightly, rippling like disturbed water. The shapes shifted, blurred, uncertain. I was afraid, I continued. That doesn't make me yours. Silence stretched, the kind that feels like a decision being made. Then slowly the fog began to thin, not vanish, but retreat. Pulling back toward the tree lines, toward the valley floor, toward whatever boundary I'd crossed without knowing it existed. The pressure lifted, the smell faded, the cold loosened its grip. By sunrise, the campground was empty again. Ordinary. Harmless looking. I left immediately. I sold the Volkswagen a month later. I still camp, but never in valleys where fog settles heavier than sound. Never where silence feels observant instead of empty. Because some places don't haunt you out of malice. They haunt you because you listened when you should have moved on. And if you ever find yourself parked somewhere quiet enough to hear your own thoughts echo, pay attention to what's listening back. I thought confronting it would end things. That was the last mistake I made in Canaan Valley. What actually ended was my ability to pretend the world works the way we want it to. The fog didn't follow me home after that second trip. No condensation on the windows, no smells drifting through open doors, no footsteps circling in the dark. For a while, I almost believed I'd done something right, said the correct words, crossed back over whatever invisible line I'd stepped across the first time. Silence returned. But silence, I learned, isn't absence. It's memory holding its breath. The changes came quietly inside me. I stopped trusting clear mornings. Bright sun felt dishonest, like a performance put on to distract from what waited underneath. When fog appeared, on highways and low fields rolling off rivers, I felt my chest tighten before my mind could explain why. My body remembered before I did. Sleep became shallow. I'd wake at 4:18 a.m. more often than coincidence allowed, heart racing, ears straining for sounds that never came. Sometimes I'd sit up in bed convinced the room felt smaller, the air heavier, like something unseen had stepped just inside the boundary of my awareness. I didn't talk about it. Not really. How do you explain that a place noticed you and decided to remember your name? Camping changed after that. I still went, but only to open ground, places where wind moved freely and sound carried far. I avoided valleys, avoided rivers at dawn, avoided anywhere fog gathered with patience instead of drift. Other campers talked about atmosphere, about peaceful mornings wrapped in mist. I smiled and nodded and kept my distance, because I knew the difference now. Fog isn't always weather. Sometimes it's a condition. The final confirmation came almost a year later, when I least expected it. I was driving through rural Pennsylvania just before sunrise, the road empty, radio low. Fog pooled ahead, thin at first, harmless looking. I slowed instinctively, hands tightening on the wheel. As I entered it, the temperature inside the car dropped. Not much, but enough. Enough to trigger memory. Enough to make my breath hitch. The smell crept in. Faint. Familiar. Not strong enough to panic me, but deliberate enough to feel intentional. The fog thickened just slightly around the car. Sound dulling. World narrowing. And for a brief, terrible moment, I felt that pressure again. The sense of attention settling over me like weight. Not claiming. Checking. I didn't speak. I didn't challenge it. I did the one thing I'd learned mattered most. I kept moving. The fog loosened its grip as the road rose, thinning naturally this time, breaking apart under early light. By the time I reached clear air, my hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over. I sat there until the sun fully crested the trees, heart slowing, breath evening out. That's when it finally clicked. The fog didn't want me. It wanted permission. Places like Canaan Valley don't attach themselves to people. They test them. They lean in close and see who stops, who listens too long, who lets curiosity override instinct. Most people pass through untouched because they don't linger. They don't open themselves up to the quiet. I had. I'd stayed still long enough to be noticed. The lesson wasn't about fear. It wasn't about monsters or spirits or whatever name makes the story easier to swallow. It was about respect, not the romantic kind people talk about when they say nature is beautiful, but the kind rooted in distance and humility. Some landscapes don't want intimacy, they want space. I still drive past Canaan Valley sometimes. I don't stop, I don't slow down. When fog settles low over the trees, thick and unmoving, I keep my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel. And every now and then, just rarely enough to doubt myself, I feel it. That subtle shift in the air, that pause in the world, like something remembering that I once listened. If you ever find yourself alone in a campground, fog pressing close, silence deeper than it should be, trust the discomfort that rises before fear fully forms. Don't wait for proof. Don't wait for sound or shape or smell. Leave. Because some things don't chase you. They don't threaten. They don't need to. They just watch and decide whether you're worth remembering. And once a place like that knows your name, it never truly forgets it.